The Center for Lifelong Learning presents Don Holt, who during his career worked with Mike Royko on the Chicago Daily News, served as managing editor of the international editions of Newsweek and Fortune magazines, marched with Martin Luther King, covered the violent 1968 Democratic Convention, chased Ariel Sharon during his tankocrat attack across the Suez Canal, and covered the presidential campaigns of 7 candidates from Lyndon Johnson to Ronald Reagan. He's semi-retired as an adjunct lecturer in journalism at Wheaton College from 1999 to 2006. He's also commonly referred to as the boy from Berwyn. I asked his daughter, Dawn, who's our chaplain, if she would give me just a word picture of her dad. This is what she wrote. I am deeply grateful for the stories our father has shared with us through the years. Stories from a front row seat to major historical events and figures told to us with his usual humility, precision, and thoughtfulness. Every one of his grandchildren has, at some point during their middle school and high school years, interviewed him to capture an up-close and personal account of historical giants like Martin Luther King Jr. and Ronald Reagan. Secondly, although our father traveled extensively around the world for his work, he was also a very present dad. We enjoyed a lot of outdoor life, camping, sailing, and bike riding. Our one sister has said it best about our dad's availability and presence amidst a busy vocation. Once when calling our dad at work for advice during college, she said, "Hi Dad, do you have time to talk?" And our dad, in his typical cheerful manner, answered, "Well, I have Moscow on the other line, but I always have time for you." Don is going to be interviewed today rather than speaking. He has requested that he be interviewed by Wally Alcorn. And then there will be a Q&A at the end for those of you who have questions here. And this whole thing will be rebroadcast at 10 o'clock on Monday on one of the local channels. Well, let's have a word of prayer before we begin. Father, once again, we thank you for the opportunity we have to be in a place where learning is possible, for continued learning through our life. We thank you for Don Holt, for the influence that he has been for to many people throughout the world. We ask your blessing now as we process this meeting. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Don Holt.
Hello, thank you.
Before we listen to you on, is there any good news anymore? Let me take you back to June 1957. I just completed 2 years of graduate school at college, and I was national news editor of Christian Life magazine. And you were in the graduation program with a bachelor's degree in English. And but I didn't remember Don Holt and this kid by the name of Don Holt who just graduated.
I'm much younger, Wally.
Yeah. so what happened after that? After we saw you go down the aisle at graduation,
Well,
what happened next? How did you get into journalism?
I'll tell you very much about that. But first of all, let me just say I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I have a pretty good connection to this place. My mom and dad were, I think, in the freshman class here in 1986, and they've lived here for 15 years. folks here. And I was on the board of what used to be called the Covenant Retirement Communities from 2002 to 2010. And then on a subsequent board, the Covenant Retirement Community Services Board until 18. So I was kind of keeping track of you, and I think that I do know a little bit about it. So thank you very much for being here. And the other thing about it is that there's a lot of people here who know me.
Yes.
Bill and Fern and Marty and and that's kind of tough because I can't slip anything by you. Before I'll answer your question, but I wanted to say one thing about the title of this. Is there any good news? And you and I talked about this. You mentioned that Garrison Keillor once said there is no such thing as good news. If it's news, it's bad.
Yeah.
Not quite my definition, but it's close. My working definition of news is a deviation from the normal. The bigger the deviation, the bigger the news. And while sometimes some of that deviation can be considered positive, mostly it's not. Mostly it's because, if you turned on the news and heard a newscast that said 438 commercial airliners flew in the skies today and they all landed safely, and that's not news, because that's supposed to happen. And that's what. And when I think about my life, I think it's been a rather. I've had a rather lifetime of bad news. We'll talk about these things in general, but I mean, right almost from the start, my first assignment at the Daily News was to cover the murder of a little 6-year-old child by a neighbor in Moore, Southgate. And then I went to home to my own 6-month-old daughter, and she was already in bed. Bad news. I was the first reporter to walk into the apartment that Richard Speck had killed 8 nurses. You might remember that news. Bad news. You mentioned that Jack mentioned the war in Israel, and so this is all kind of what I would call bad news. And then there's 9/11. I worked in that building for 5 years, the last 5 years of my career, in Tower 2, the one that went down first. And I left in 99. So, whoops, how did that go? No. And I often think in terms of darkness when I think about this bad news. I think in terms of darkness, I think of the John's gospel, that men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. When I first came to Wheaton College to teach in 99, do you remember Gary Hogan, the International Justice Ministry? They had a worldwide campaign against human trafficking and those sorts of things. And he told me, we had lunch together, he said, every one of those things that he was trying to combat was illegal in the country in which it was happening. But it was done in the dark. And what he did was put light on it by doing lawsuits and doing publicity. And as soon as you spread light, evil steps to flee. And I kind of think, without being too overblown, I think journalism is a little bit of putting light on things. And I felt that's a pretty good career to have. So, how do I get from Wheaton College to this? It starts with writing. I was, one of the things I did, most of the time I was an editor or a manager, but for 2 years, at my own request, I became a Fortune writer. And it was a great job because you had a lot of time to do it. You always had an assistant that went with you, and I did that for 2 years. You had a lot of time to do it. And so I really enjoyed that little interlude. Then I got back to editing and managing. But while I was writing, I was having lunch with some other writers, and one of them said, you know, a group of them, he said, we're all here because at some point, some teacher told us we could write. And it sounded like a sentence. But I think that's true in my case. I went to Wheaton College. I started as a pre-med. I was very interested in that. But I also I kind of had noticed in high school that when I wrote something, teachers would sort of take notice. I got to Wheaton as a freshman, in my freshman year. I was in an English class with a professor named Helen Simmel, some of you might know her. DeVed, she married Bob DeVed eventually. And she took me aside one day, called me after class, said, stay after class. She said, you know, you don't have a clue about the rules of grammar. You couldn't pass a grammar test if they were going to take you out and shoot you. Pause. But you never make mistakes. And you write very well. And she said, I'm assuming that you were always a writer, a reader when you were young. I said, that's true. That's what it is. And she became a mentor and encouragement. So I think at some point I switched to the English department and I decided that I was going to somehow, as a vocation, I was going to write. And I didn't know how. I thought maybe public relations. I wasn't going to write novels because I didn't think I was any good at that. At Wheaton College, I was on a Codo and I wrote some short stories, and I think they were passable, but they were not going to be career-worthy. But I didn't know, and I was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Army through ROTC, and I was going into the Army, and I thought, well, I'll have time to sort this out. In 1958, I graduated in 57. In 1958, Eisenhower cut the budget, cut the defense budget big, and half of our class became six-monthers, and I was one of them, and all of a sudden, in the summer of 58, I had to find a job. And I heard about a fellow that I knew vaguely, named Bob Smith, who had been he'd been an Elmhurst College guy, and he had gone to the Elmhurst Press, a weekly newspaper in Elmhurst, as the sports editor, and he had just left for the Daily News. Well, I always wanted to go to the Daily News, so I figured, okay, I'll follow Bob Smith, and I took that job, and I did that for a year. Eventually did get to the Daily News. And it's all based on writing. In those days, I don't know, maybe it's all different now, but we'll talk about that later. But you got your job, you got a job by showing the clips where you had worked. You came with a whole scrapbook of clips. That's how you applied for a job, and I got the job at the News. Mike Gorka was there. He had just come. We worked together on the overnight desk. In those days, newspapers had three shifts called the day side, the night side, and the middle watch. And we did both the middle watch together and the night side. And he's a very fun guy. Did not graduate from high school. I don't know how much you know this. Those of you who read his columns. But he went into service and got his GED and eventually came back and did not go to college and then went to work for the City News Bureau and eventually to the Daily News. Sometimes it would get kind of boring at night, in the middle of the night, and this is before Google. The city desk of the Daily News overnight was a source for college kids who had papers due in the morning. And we would get calls. Can you tell me everything about Franklin Roosevelt? Or we would get people and again, no cell phones, we would get people in bars trying to settle bets. And if Mike took the call, the first guy would say, whatever the question was, or Andy Pafko or something, and Mike would say, "You're right." "Oh, good. Tell my buddy." Put him on the phone. "Hello?" Mike would say, "You're right." Waiting for the call, waiting for the siren. But that was, so I think that's really how I got started. And then from the Daily News, I went on to Newsweek as joined the Chicago Bureau of Newsweek, became the bureau chief in 1966 when I was 30. I was one of the youngest they had. And eventually, 1971, we moved to New York.
Remind us what Newsweek was.
It was a news magazine. It was the competitor of Time magazine. We used to talk about Time magazine as Brand X in our meetings. We didn't want to use the name. So, and then it rolled on from there. Okay, so that's how it happened.
Well, Toni Morrison, who's a novelist, who's won the Nobel and the Pulitzer as well,
Right.
said that goodness is put backstage. It's evil that gets the spotlight. And she had talked about said that very few novels that feature good news or goodness ever get published because it's evil that sells, not good.
I think that's right. I would agree with that.
If it's good, and it's not news, is the gospel good news?
Absolutely. We call it.
Why? Doesn't that contradict what you said or differ from what you said?
I don't think the gospel is a deviation from the normal. I think it's a deviation to the good side.
Or from the usual, at least.
From the usual.
Maybe what's in the gospel is normal.
Right.
And what is usual. Okay.
Right.
Plus the fact that's what the word evangelion means. Good news. Yeah, okay.
You all know Wally was a preacher.
Just so, what is journalism as distinct from other expository writing or distinct from literary writing, such as poetry and so forth?
I think that's good. That's a very good question. First of all, I think the calling is one of the. I can think of only a few endeavors that really seek, and you're going to maybe gasp at this, but seek the truth. The academy is another, science is another. Wherever it leads, and when I was a reporter, I was enjoyed the fact of finding out, get to the bottom of it. You didn't always, but so that's one thing. A lawyer is an advocate, a businessman is producing a product and trying to promote it, but we were supposed to find out what happened and who's responsible, what's going to happen next, and try to get to the bottom of it. But in terms of writing, I think the words, I think that I always felt that my life was dedicated to words. Words on paper, words on a screen, words in the ether, words struck together to make sentences to tell a story about what actually happened. And I think the difference between that, expository writing is I'm telling you about something. Either something that happened or something that you'd like to know about, something that we'd like to know about. And it's trying to marshal the facts in ways that are most efficient so you can get the story. One of the things that I would teach is the economy of the language, and I think this is another difference between journalism and what I never was very good at what people call creative writing, because I don't think I was that creative. But I used to teach them, I found a sentence in a pamphlet from the World Bank that said, the overall completion of the entire project is estimated at 50%. What does that mean? Half done. It's about half done. That's what that means. And so I think that's one big difference. It doesn't mean that you can't be somewhat. I wouldn't say I don't think I was ever poetic. I wrote a cover story on Ronald Reagan, you see, up there, and I don't think I was poetic, but I did tell you what the man would be like.
Can you, when you're listening to a journalist, you're reading a journalist, watching one on television, can you be sure he's giving you his facts?
No.
Well, if
let me ask you a somewhat rhetorical question. How do you know what you know? Or how do you know what you think you know? How do you know what happened today in Wheaton and Carroll Stream and Chicago and Myanmar and in Delhi and in London? In your own family, your extended family? How do you know? In terms of your family, you were told by somebody, if it's some relative is a distance away and something happened, you were told about it, and you assumed it was correct. How did you know? One way you knew is who was telling you. If a particular relative that you were sort of told the things before that never gave you any sub jobs, you say, well, that's probably true. And I think that so how do you know about these things outside of it? Here, you know by someone in the media telling you. So how do you know? I would say that when I was working, we tried hard to be as honest as we could. But as a consumer of the information, how do you do it? Well, you do it by, over time, you learn how to trust that particular outlet. And I think that's the answer to your question. You can't know. There's no way you know how well that reported. And I would also say, particularly in the current environment of watching cable news and I'd be skeptical about what you hear. There is an old story you might have heard. There was a crusty editor in the Chicago City News Bureau, which was a place that owned by the when there were 4 newspapers when I started to work, that covered all the mundane court cases and everything, and then they fed it to the big papers. But there was a crusty editor there who was famous for saying, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. And that came about because he was berating this young reporter about something, and the reporter said, well, my mother loves me. And he said that. But I think that's a healthy skepticism. I think that's what we were taught as young reporters at the Daily News.
Well, you pick up a newspaper, for instance, Chicago Tribune. There's the front page, and then you page through, and there's the sports section, the business, the opinion page, the op-ed page, and all of that sort. How does your receptivity vary between the people?
That depends how much you know about it, I think. If you're a sports fan, you probably will read the sports page differently than if you're not. Or if you're, you know, if you're involved in business and so forth. And again, you have to learn to either trust or not. And if you don't trust a publication, then no, I wouldn't read it. If you decide that enough times you came to find out that it wasn't true, I think that. But I can't vouch for all the truth or not in newspapers.
Well, you know, in evangelical circles, we know the word hermeneutics, methods of interpreting the Bible.
Correct.
Is there such a thing as hermeneutics of journalism?
I don't think so. I'm not sure. I'm not going there.
Okay. How about the presidents now? Now, did you talk to some who were candidates, probably more who was candidates and actually became presidents? What was that experience?
Well, that was one of the fun things about it. I was involved in presidential campaigns from LBJ to Reagan, and that's from '64 to 1980. In one way or another, and the way presidential campaigns were done, the national press, which I was part of, and the networks, would always assign somebody to each candidate from the beginning of the campaign. But it couldn't go nonstop for 4 months, so there would be, you know, they would get a week off here and there, and often some of us who were not assigned to that would get a chance to ride. And so the first time that happened was LBJ, Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and I was told that, hey, you can fill in. Chuck Roberts was our Washington correspondent, and he was on the plane, but he wanted to take a day off, so a week off, so I wrote with Johnson, and then I wrote with Barry Goldwater. And it was a great experience. I was quite young. I remember being told by the old timers, stay as close as you can to the body. And so when we got off at some stop, we got off the plane, and Johnson went charging down the rope line, or at least the fence line of an airport where people were hanging out. I'm right behind him. About 4 or 5 reporters, the rest of them didn't bother, but I was right there with Johnson. And all of a sudden he got to, didn't realize that there was an end to the fence, and he turned around and he just about kissed me. And I tell you, he is a big man. And I backed off and said something, mumbled something about Mr. President. But that was a great experience, and I think that particular election, you would, as you get into presidential campaigns, they develop a narrative. And the narrative of that year was that Barry Goldwater wanted to escalate in Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson did not. And I heard Johnson say again and again, stop after stop, I'm not sending American boys 8,000 miles to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. And he'd get a roar of applause from the crowd. Barry Goldwater wanted to escalate. He wanted to defoliate the jungle with Agent Orange, which did happen. And so it was a choice. And I think that the people did turn down the idea of war. There was a joke going around, you might remember it. People said, they told me if I voted for Goldwater, there would be war. So I voted for Goldwater, and sure enough, there was war. But, so that was that one. I think that I actually only, and then I wrote the plane with a few other people and candidates in primaries. Bobby Kennedy, we spent a lot of time with him. Campaigns were fun. They were somewhat exhausting. We were all together as the TV guys and as the print guys and sometimes the local big papers, wherever you went. I remember one time we were covering Bobby Kennedy. We got out to Wyoming. spending the night, and about 12 of us got the hotel to open up the pool. And at midnight, we played water polo for about an hour. I think Sander Van Oker was there, and a lot of names you might remember. I think it was Van Oker who had his 3 rules of covering campaigns. They were never stand when you can sit, never walk past a men's room without using it, eat whatever and whenever you can. Those were the 3 rules. So it was a great deal of fun. And I had 2 actual, most of the time what we were doing was listening to what they said at every stop. The daily people had to check be sure the candidate was not saying different things in different places, that sort of thing. But I had 2 cases in which I actually had to interview, got a face-to-face interview. One was with Reagan, and one was with Jimmy Carter. And with Jimmy Carter, I was the editor of the Newsweek International, so I was concerned about international things. And I noticed he wasn't saying anything. No one was asking him about foreign policy, so I called his press secretary and said I wanted to have a sit down with him. So when he got get on the plane, and we actually did that. When I think there's a picture of it up here, of Jimmy and I sitting in a plane interviewing. And I did a really thorough, enjoyable interview that we syndicated. It actually ran 2 full pages in the Chicago Tribune. It was the first time anybody had asked him questions about his foreign policy. And then Reagan, the Reagan story is kind of interesting. I think Jimmy Carter was, as you know, famously a born-again Christian, and the press corps found him somewhat aloof, and one reporter I know found him she thought he was almost nasty, until he found out that she had gone forward in the Billy Graham Crusade in New York City in 1957, but was no longer following the faith. So Jimmy spent the next several weeks trying to get her back into the fold. Reagan, by this time now I'm in Fortune magazine, and they don't do politics too much. And on Friday afternoon in the spring, we were in an editorial meeting, and somebody said, and I don't remember who it was, why don't we forget about all these primaries, and he was running against John Anderson, who was a member of the Covenant Church, you might know, and George Bush. A lot of primaries. Why don't we just cut from that and say, well, if he wins, what would he be like? That had never been done. It's done all the time now, but that was somebody's idea. Let's do a story that we're in April. We're talking about November. Let's just do a story that says, if he wins, what would he be like? And yeah, that's a good idea. And all eyes kind of turned toward me, because everybody knew I was the only guy that had ever had experience with politics. And I said, I'll do it. Okay, but we needed the next issue. We got 3 weeks. So it was a Friday night, went home on the train. Lita picked me up. Before I got in the car, I stopped on a payphone on the train platform, and I called. I didn't know anybody in the Reagan organization, because I had been out of that for quite a while. But Jerry Lubenow, who was the Newsweek San Francisco bureau chief, and I knew all about Reagan, was somebody who worked for me, and I knew it pretty well, and I still had his phone number in my book. I called Jerry on a Friday afternoon. I said, Jerry, I gotta go. I got to get on the Reagan plane. Who do I call? He gave me the numbers. Ed Meese, I got Ed Meese on the phone. And the next thing I know, it says, yeah, we're in North Carolina, meet us in Charlotte, and we join the team. The next morning, I flew out to Charlotte and got on the Reagan team. But all week, so in order to finish this, I had to have a sit down with Reagan. From the first day to meet Ed Meese, I said, I have to have an interview at some point. Oh yeah, we'll do that, we'll take care of it. The week went on, we flew from here, we flew from there, we were in hotels, and I never got my interview until the end of the week. Now it's Friday night. I said, Ed, we're breaking for the weekend. Reagan's going to Santa Monica for the weekend. What do I do? He said, well, he's flying down in a private plane. You can fly with him. There'll only be 6 of us, and you can have it. And that's what we did. We were in a twin-engine Cessna, 6-passenger, sitting like Reagan and I like this. People had always said he was hard of hearing, but but we're yelling at each other because these twin engines are propeller airplane. But I got a whole hour because it was a slow plane, and that was my Reagan interview. And he told me things that he told me one thing. Again, if you remember all that, it's a long time ago, but he was proposing tax cuts, and people were all over the place and being critical of that. And he said to me, he said, well, we're going to do this over 3 years, so after the first year, if it's not working, you can stop. And he had never said that. And we put it in the piece. And no one else ever said that, and he never said it again, and I think his staff got to him and said, hey, you can't say that. But let's see, I think other characters, I think I covered briefly. Nelson Rockefeller ran for president in 1968, and I was trailing him around. I remember him telling an audience, I think in Mattoon, Illinois, he was sitting there looking at Nelson Rockefeller, wondering, trying to figure out what this is all about. And he told a story. He said, when I was a little boy, I came upon my grandfather. That would have been John D. Rockefeller, the man that started it all, on his knees behind his desk looking for something. And he told me, he said, I'm looking for a nickel I dropped. And he said to me, Nelson Rockefeller saying, son, that's 5% interest on $1 for a whole year. These people in Mattoon are thinking, I'm looking at that. Needless to say, Nelson Rockefeller did not win. So that's the presidential.
Now, which of these men did you like the most personally?
Oh, that's a good question. It's hard to. I got to. Most of the time, you're ready to get too close to them, and there was, but some of them I did in the primaries, and then after. Had an interesting experience with Hubert Humphrey. I did not cover him, but when he lost, and he had to do something with his life. Now when Nixon lost, he was a lawyer, so he joined a law firm in New York City. But Hubert Humphrey was a pharmacist, and he wasn't going to do that. So he decided to take a teaching position, a joint position at Carleton College and the University of Minnesota. And so the day that he was going to start teaching, the magazine sent me up there, and nobody else did it. And so I was the only guy there with his old press secretary, and we went to the university in the evening. We went to Malcolm Moose's, the president of the university was Malcolm Moose, the guy who wrote the speech for Eisenhower that said, military-industrial complex. And so we all sat around in the evening having coffee after the speech. Next day, we went to Carleton, where he was having his first classes. It happened to be the day that Nixon landed in Paris on his first presidential visit to Europe. And as we walked around the campus, and the snow was up to your waist, it was so cold, we'd go in buildings, and there would be a TV on, and there would be Nixon getting off Air Force One, and there would be playing Hail to the Chief, and Gilbert would look at it, oh, he was getting angrier and angrier. And I really saw kind of a human side to him, and finally I went back to his little office, and they gave him a little office in the second floor of the building in Carleton. He was sort of jammed in there, and so I said, well, you know, Mr. Vice President, what can we expect from you? Are you going to? And he was so angry. He just said, you can't run for office on a college campus. And then, 2 years later, he did run for office. He ran for the Senate again, where he had served in Minnesota, and I went up again. And he had to win a primary. And this is kind of an insight into this mindset of big-time politicians. I was with him. He was running around the neighborhood, and his wife, Muriel, was running around on his behalf, and they met at a little storefront headquarters they had. And so we come in there, and Hubert stashes me in the waiting room, and they go in. He goes in to meet Muriel, and it's one of those storefronts where the walls didn't go more than 7 feet, you know, so they could hear everything. And it was fascinating that these two were talking about this commodity called Humphrey. And he would say, well, what did they think Humphrey, you know, and she'd say, well, no, they think Humphrey needs to do that. And they were discussing the marketing of this character called Humphrey who was in the room. So that's a little bit insight. Yeah, but I also had a chance to spend a lot of personal time with
Okay, there are going to be a lot of questions here.
Yeah, we're getting to the point where
Yeah,
you want to.
but before we do that, let me take you back to 1968.
Yeah.
The Democratic National Convention is meeting in Chicago at the International Amphitheater. There is demonstrations, rioting in the streets. The Chicago police are accused of a police riot.
Yep.
Richard Daley is mayor, and he's acting up.
Yep.
Where were you during that?
I was in the convention hall. I was the bureau chief, and my people were out in the street getting beat up. But I was in the hall, and I knew Daley. He knew me. I had done some stories on him, and so I went to. He had because it was Chicago and because it was Democrats, because he was Daley, he had a delegation right in front of the podium, right down front, and he was sitting in the very front row. So I went up and knelt down on one knee, and he recognized me, and I said, "So, Mr. Mayor, how do you think of what's going on outside in the streets?" And he looked at me, and he didn't say anything. He made a slight gesture with his fingers, and I felt my arms being lifted, 2 guys on either side, lifted up and unceremoniously came up the aisle. And from then on, nobody talked to David. But I had some insights. There's a movie out now called The Chicago 7. If you get a chance to see it, it's pretty interesting. If you remember those days, we were all young then, weren't we? But I think what happened, that spring, there had been, Martin Luther King had been assassinated, and there had been a riot in Chicago. And the Chicago police had performed, I think, quite well. They were operating under conditions that had been set by a chief named Orlando Wilson, and they were minding their own business pretty well. I mean, they kept it under control, but they didn't shoot a lot of people, and they just, so daily, the next day, this is in April, in a press conference, said that the chief disobeyed my orders. Police chief was a guy named Jim Thomas. I ordered them to shoot to kill arsonists and shoot to maim looters. Shoot to maim looters, shoot to kill arsonists. And they disobeyed my orders. They did not do that. Well, the police were stunned. There had been no such order. That was a political statement. But they got the message. And I think part of it, when the demonstrations began and when the parks needed to be cleared, they weren't going to get reprimanded again. I think that's part of what happened, and it was a tragedy. Detroit
was pretty bad too during that time. Where did you get over there?
I did, and that was a riot in which 41 people were killed. I saw one of the deaths with I was standing about 20 feet away in the middle of the night when a National Guardsman shot a man in a car, killed him. Subsequently, they indicted a bunch of people on both sides, and then the National Guardsmen and the policemen who were involved in that incident, I believe, hooked up a story and charged the young man who was driving the car. His car had come in the intersection and it had sort of taken a turn and tried to get out. And they shot at it and they killed this young man in the passenger seat. And then they put this kid, the driver, on trial for attempted murder because they said he had tried to run over a policeman.
Oh.
So in 1970, I get a call. I'm doing something. I'm out on a campaign in Nebraska somebody. Get a call from this young lawyer, an African-American lawyer in Detroit. He asked me, he understood I was there because I think one of the Detroit papers had done an exhaustive look at every death, and I think I was mentioned. He said, tell me what happened, and I told him. He said, oh, if you can testify, would you come? And he said, I can't pay you. No, I didn't pay you. No. So I did. I went to the trial. And flew in late at night. The next morning went to the trial. And I knew that he hadn't come anywhere near a policeman. It was totally fabricated. And I told that story. And he was acquitted. And I was very pleased about that.
Yeah. Good. Okay, Adrian, you have a mic, and we have some questions.
Ray Smith, hey. This is going to be hard.
I want to know if anyone here knew Don before I did, which was in 1954.
This is going to be a zinger.
Not
Come on. You do your best, Ray.
I'm disappointed that he didn't mention that we both started out as sports writers.
I did mention it.
You did? Okay. And we witnessed the most unusual incident
Right.
in Wheaton College athletic history. We were the only press there and the only ones brave enough to write about it. Don, you want to tell that story?
I think, forget the players, but we have a guy breaking for the goal line along the sideline. He's in the clear. He's gone and he's going to score against North Central. And a guy, a North Central player, comes off the bench and tackles him. And the officials didn't see it.
3 officials didn't see it. The North Central coach did.
Yes, he did.
And he clipped that out of the
film?
film. I have talked to the player that came off the bench. He became a school teacher. So Don and I witnessed that, and we reported it in our respective.
Okay, are there other, Adrian?
Ray was a better sports writer than I am.
He's a great sports writer.
Questions? Yes? Right here.
Can you tell us what is your daily diet of news resources? Oh, that's a good question.
Well, I listen to all the cable, Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN. I read the New York Times, and I read the Tribune right now. We just moved and it's not coming, I think that's about it right now. I used to read Fortune magazine. I used to read, until last year, I kind of let that go. I used to read The Economist.
Is there a reason you no longer read The Economist?
I just had for renewal, and it's a lot of money, and I just didn't write the check. I probably will get that. You know, American magazines are all cheap. You can get whatever the cover price is, they'll discount it down to nothing, but The Economist does not. It's about $100 a year.
Thank you.
It's good magazine.
You work for a newspaper. Unfortunately, newspapers are disappearing
Yes.
from our lives. And replaced somehow by all the TV channels.
Right. TV and social media and internet.
Yes,
Unregulated.
How dire do you think this is?
Good. How dire is it? Good question. Let me take you back to the year 1445. 1445, and Bibles were being produced by monks and scribes, ready, and they produced about one a year. And then over in Germany, this fellow printed the printing press. And within a few years, it caused the Renaissance. It changed all of your books and Bibles, and I think the digital revolution in this time, in my lifetime, is of that magnitude. Is it dire? I don't know. I can't stop it. I mean, it's so I think that when I started at the Elmhurst Press, out the back, right behind my office, was a whole bunch of guys at lineman type machines, hot type. Went to the news, the same thing. Then at Newsweek, we gradually transitioned to keyboard and computers. And so, yeah, I think newspapers will be gone before too long, maybe 10 years. What will replace it? Okay, I think is it dire? To some extent it is, because a lot of the replacements are unverified. You get information on the net. When I was on publications, we did an awful lot of work of fact checking. That happens at all. On the other hand, it is somewhat akin to the way this country began, when everybody could have a paper, printing press, and people did, and so there was a multiplicity of voices, and so in some ways, that's what we've got now, a multiplicity of voices, and I think the discernment factor for readers has to be very high. So that's what I would say.
What about social media? What effect does that have on the news consuming public?
It has a lot of effect, but I think that, and I don't know. That's where the dire comes in. I think people get information that they have no way of. You know, when I started talking about how do you know, you got to find out how people, who you can trust. And if you're on social media, you don't know. You don't know who it is. So I think That's the answer.
All right, we're just about at time. Is there one final question from the audience? One? You're welcome to come up and see Mr. Holt individually, but anything now?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for Don Holt. We thank you for these years of service to the public, to the kingdom of God as well. We pray that you would help us to process what we have heard today so that we can use it to be responsible citizens. We ask it in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much.